All right, welcome everybody. So today we're going to be talking about weeding. We're entering June, which is what I call the month of grass. This is usually when weeds are growing the most aggressively because it's still relatively cool for summer, but it's also the time of year when we have the most daylight hours. And usually we're also still getting rain, although this month that has not been the case. And so we are going to talk about weed management. So we are first going to talk about why you weed, and then we're going to go over some weed prevention techniques, and then we're going to go over kind of our favorite tools for actually weeding once you have weeds, because you're going to have weeds. So first, the reason that we weed, there's a couple different reasons that we weed. So one of the big ones that I feel like is not talked about a lot is just so that we can actually find our plants, especially when they're young and this time of year. Like here, we've got big broccoli over there. We're not going to lose that in the weeds. But these guys over here are eggplant. And as you can see, some of these are still pretty small. And so if you don't weed, if you're not weeding regularly, it can be pretty easy to kind of lose your plants in the weeds. We have weeded this bed about once a week. And you can see even with doing that, this one thing of grass is basically just as tall. So if we're not weeding regularly, we can't find the plants. And if we can't find the plants, we can't take care of them. We can't make sure that they're not having major pest infestations, all those different things. The other kind of more classic reason that we weed, that people talk about, is that weeds do compete for resources in the soil, especially if it's a situation where you don't have regular irrigation and it's not raining. The weeds can really compete for moisture in the soil. So that's why we weed, along with some other things. But one of the first things that I always want to mention before we get into how to weed is weed prevention. So these are things that will reduce the number of weeds. There is nothing that is going to completely eliminate weeds, 100%, other than chemicals and special plants. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about vegetables. And so the main way that we do that is a covering of the soil. So what would be a mulch, or a weed fabric or a weed barrier of some kind. Generally speaking, we don't love the plastic weed barriers for vegetable gardens just because they end up being kind of a single use in that instance, which isn't great, and it's plastic. But you can do some biodegradable options. So one would be burlap, or just some sort of fabric material that you're not using anymore. Burlap is an organic, or it's a natural fiber. So it does biodegrade. And you can get these are old coffee bags. You can get them from a lot of coffee roasters. If you reach out and you talk to any coffee shop or coffee roaster around your area, you can ask them if you can get bags. Usually they'll say yes, because they're usually just throwing them away. But the way that you would use a barrier like this, like a fabric material, or cardboard also works similarly, is you literally just lay it wherever you don't want weeds to be. So in this instance, and our rows are a little narrow for this fabric, but we can just fold it in half and then just kind of lay it on the soil surface. And then you would generally want to have something to weigh that down so the wind doesn't just blow it away. You could just put rocks on it, or you could put some wood chips or something to just kind of weigh it down a little bit. Or you could use what's called a sod staple, which is just a piece of metal that looks like a big staple that you just push through the material into the ground to secure it. So what this is going to do is, because it's covering the soil surface, the light cannot hit the soil, which is going to make the life of a weed pretty hard, because most weeds need light to germinate. And even if they don't need it to germinate, if they germinate, they then have to try and push through this material to grow, which is not very likely. So you can do something like this. You are still going to get weeds, because even if you do this everywhere, you're going to get weeds in these gaps kind of between it, but it's going to cut down on how much weeding that you need to do in your bed in total. It will also help hold moisture in your soil, which is also good for your plants. You don't need to water as often. The other option would be mulch, which is the same idea as a weed barrier material. Its job is to cover the soil so that it's excluding light, making germination and growth harder for weeds. You can use any dead plant material. This is straw that we had. It's actually some that we keep for the chickens. But you can also use the leaves from your yard in the fall if you keep them. You could use grass clippings. You could use wood chips. You can use any dead plant material. but kind of these lighter materials are our preference because they break down more quickly. Things like wood chips can be a little harder in a vegetable garden because they tend to get kind of mixed into the soil, and then it's difficult in following seasons to plant little seeds because they take a long time to break down, and then you get these big kind of clumps of wood, which are kind of a problem. So we like kind of these lighter materials like straw or leaves or grass or even weeds. Actually, if you look, there's a bed over there that's mostly mulched with all the weeds that we've ripped out. So with mulch, you're just gonna kind of break it up a little bit, and you're just gonna lay it on the soil surface around all of your plants. And as you look on here, you can see it's pretty thick. You are not seeing any soil through this little patch. And that's what you want. Because if you're putting just a light, you know, I've seen some people where they mulch and they'll do like this number. That's not gonna do anything because you can still see the soil through there. All these little gaps where you can see the soil, weeds are gonna come up through. So this is really doing nothing except making weeding harder for you. So you want a nice thick layer of mulch, and you would, again, do that all around the plants and everything. I find this to be a little easier than like a burlap material, simply because you can go all the way around the plants really easily. So you get fewer weeds. You're still gonna get some weeds here and there, especially if there's any perennial weeds that are growing. So things like dandelion, you know, if you chop the top off a dandelion and you throw this on top, those leaves are still gonna pop up. But for the annual weeds, which is most of them in a vegetable garden, it's gonna do a really good job at preventing those weeds from growing. So those are kind of the two main techniques for preventing weeds in the garden, which can be really helpful at all times of year, but especially this time of year. And then also I wanted to mention, this does also have that same benefit of the weed barrier in terms of it's conserving moisture. So, you know, if this irrigation is running, you can see, you know, we have this irrigation line here, this soil is wet, you can see it's darker, this is lighter over here. If this mulch is on top of it, this is gonna stay wet a lot longer because it's not gonna be in direct, the sun isn't gonna be directly hitting it, evaporating it. So you need less water, the soil stays wet longer, and it also helps keep the soil cooler. Like the literal, like if you stick a thermometer into the soil under this mulch will be cooler than over here because this is blocking it from the sun, and because it's light and fluffy, it's insulation. And so it's literally preventing that heat of the day from dissipating in and warming up the soil, which is really helpful when we get into extreme heat situations to reduce the stress on the plants. So now I'm gonna remove this just so we can talk about our next thing here. So the next thing is you're still gonna get weeds, or you know, if you don't do mulch or you don't do weed barriers, you just don't like them for whatever reason, you're gonna have to weed, or even if you do them, like I said, there are still gonna be some weeds. So there's a couple different ways to manage weeds. The most basic way is to just rip them out with your hand. That's the way that most of us do, you know, literally just grab it at the roots and pull it out. Works for a lot of weeds, but there are some tools that can make that job go faster, especially when you have big open areas like this in between the plants. One thing I always like to talk about though is for any tool that has like a blade on it or like an edge, a sharp edge, which includes pretty much anything you're going to weed with. So any sort of hoe or, you know, stirrup hoe or whatever you have, having this edge being sharp is going to make your life a lot easier. Oftentimes when these come from the store, they're pretty dull because they don't want a bunch of really sharp stuff just like out in the store and people cutting themselves or dropping them or whatever. And so they come relatively blunt. So it can be really helpful to sharpen these. And there's a whole art to sharpening, but you don't need to be like amazing at it. But it's literally just a file or a rasp or something, but like a file. And then you just take it at about, you know, kind of like a 45-degree angle, and you can just kind of run it over that surface. And you can do kind of a rough sharpening like that. And then you kind of go in one direction, that way. And then on the bottom, you just go this way. And then if you do that, again, it's not like super sharp, but it's a lot sharper than it's gonna be normally. And what that does is it's gonna make this cut through the soil a lot easier, which is much less stress on your joints and muscles trying to chop through soil, especially in the summer when the soil tends to be a little drier, a little harder. You're not trying to like hack through dirt with a blunt edge. So there's kind of 4 tools here that we're going to talk about that we like. So this is, you know, the kind of classic garden hoe. So this one is good, especially if you let the weeds get a little bigger. The best way to weed is to weed very often, like at least once a week. You should be out there just cutting all the weeds. And the reason that you do that is it's much, much less work, much less strenuous on you to kill a weed that is this size than to kill a weed that is, you know, really big. And they can grow really fast this time of year. And so you want to weed pretty often. So this one though, this tool, compared to the other ones we'll talk about, is better if the weeds do get a little bigger, just because there's a little bit more weight to it. But the kind of the easiest way on you to use this tool is to actually stand upright, and instead of chopping, like I see a lot of times where people like want to chop with a hoe, and this is a lot of strain on you. The better way, and you can see as with the angle here, this is the angle you should be holding it, which is why it's bent at that angle. So instead of chopping it out in front of you like this, you can kind of stand to the side and you do one of these numbers where you're skimming it just under the soil surface, and it's going to chop the weeds out of the ground. So you can see kind of these guys over here, and you can just almost kind of scrape the soil, but standing upright, which is easier on your back, it's easier on your shoulders, it's just easier overall, especially if you're doing a lot of weeding. And you just kind of scrape just right under the soil surface, and it just chops those weeds off, and they are dead. And that's basically all there is to using this kind of tool. And again, as long as it's sharp, it'll do that pretty well for you. Go over the little fence here. And all those weeds, you can pick them up, or we usually leave them here, because generally just that cutting right under the soil surface is going to be enough to kill them, especially when we're not getting rain. They're just going to dry out on the soil surface. They're not going to do that. You know, if you did this and then it like poured rain, the roots might kind of root back into the ground, but that's not going to happen. So a couple other hoes, like stand-up options. There's this one called a stirrup hoe, which is another one that is really nice to use. It's nice to have it relatively sharp. They usually come a little sharper, but the blade is on both sides, which is unique. So both of these sides are relatively sharp. And this is one though that is really only works if the weeds are pretty small. If your weeds are getting big and they're like dense, this is not going to work well. But if you're keeping on top of your weeds and you have this guy, it works really well. And what it does is you can both pull with it. So you just like set it on the surface, and again, it's kind of bent at the angle you're supposed to use it. So, kind of hold it like this, so it's flat on the bottom, and you can kind of pull it towards you, and it'll pull right under the soil surface and cut those weeds. You can see, chopped. They're gonna dry. This is one that I did that with yesterday. You can see it's all dried up. It's dead. But because the blade is on both sides, you can do a push-pull motion if you wanted to. So you can pull with it, but you can also kind of push with it. And so you can kind of go back and forth, making sure you get all the weeds in an area, chopping everything out. So this is one that because the blade is narrow, it's also a little easier to get closer to the plants without damaging the plants than with the first hoe that we talked about. So you can see like this guy, the root is pretty close here to the base of my eggplant. So that would be pretty hard to chop with the hoe or to cut with the hoe without hitting this. But with this, you can kind of sneak in there to the side and kind of chop them out. So again, this one is really nice, but only if the weeds are small. But you can do this kind of push-pull where you're just kind of scraping the soil surface, getting all those weeds chopped out for you. And it can even work on this like annoying Bermuda grass, which we're not gonna eliminate with this technique, but we'll kind of chop the tops off, but you can see, or maybe you can see, how much more force I need to use to kind of chop these because they're bigger than I was using on the other things. So this is called, again, this is either a stirrup hoe or a push-pull hoe, they're called sometimes, or a hoop hoe. They've got a lot of different names. So then the third type of hoe is what's just called a push hoe. So same thing here, where you want to sharpen this blade if it's not sharp, because that sharpness is going to help you. And so it's kind of a combination of those two in terms of what it does. You can see there, and there's lots of different designs, but with this one, again, kind of the angle of the tool tells you kind of how you should be using it. So you should be kind of holding it like this, and then you can see that blade is pretty flat on the soil surface, and that's how you're supposed to be using it. So it's the same idea as the stirrup hoe, except it's only a push motion. So what's nice about this one is that this one is really easy because it's like you can get really fine motions with this one, relatively easy. You can get really close to other stuff. You can get kind of these really fine motions, and I don't know if you can get down here and kind of see. So there's this grass that's really close here to this eggplant. So it's relatively easy for me to go, and because I can do these short little kind of chopping motions, I can get that grass out from around that eggplant, and the eggplant is still fine. Whereas again, with that big hoe, it's going to be really hard to do that without also hitting this. And the same with the stirrup hoe, because that blade is just bigger. The closer you get, the harder it is. And these little tiny push motions that this allows you gives you the ability to get those. And it's just a smaller tool overall, like width-wise, so you can get into to tighter spaces. So again, this is a push hoe, and there's several different designs of push hoes. This is just the one that we happen to have here today. And then the last item I wanted to talk about, I actually do not know the technical name for, unfortunately. This is what it looks like. So it's just got kind of this little triangular shaped blade on it, and it's a hand tool. So these are really nice, especially if you have plants that are closer together, where maybe these are a little big and bulky to do the job, and this can get you into those really tight spaces. So it's the same idea as the first hoe that we talked about, where you're kind of scraping the soil surface. So so same thing. You want to sharpen this. So I just sharpened this a minute ago. So you want to sharpen it, and then you can just kind of come in here and you just kind of scrape the soil surface wherever there are weeds. And this is a great example up here too, where we've got this fence that we put up to keep rabbits that were eating the broccoli out, but there's weeds that grow underneath it. These first two hoes are not gonna get under that fence. The push hoe would. So another benefit of the push hoe here. So the push hoe, because you can push right underneath it, but this little hoe, you can also do that to some degree. You can kind of go off to the side, and you can kind of get these little weeds that are in the way and that are growing underneath that fence that we want to get rid of. Keep it nice and clean. So those are the main tools that we like. There's lots of other kind of specialized tools, but those are some good kind of general weeding tools that you can use. And then just the last thing, which I mentioned a little bit, is again, I usually just leave the weeds laying on the soil surface. If it's a weed that has kind of already gone to seed, and especially if it's like a really aggressive weed, it can make sense to remove it. If I've got like bindweed or something that has seed pods all over it, I'm gonna not leave that in the bed because I don't want bindweed growing any more than it needs to. Or if I have a bunch of Bermuda grass where I would like ripped up the roots and I was able to get the roots out, I'm not going to leave those roots because they'll root and just keep growing again. But all of this kind of little stuff that there's no seeds on, it's just kind of leafy material, that's not going to hurt anything to just leave on the bed. But you are also welcome to clean that up and give it to your chickens, throw it in your compost, whatever you want to do with it. Or you can scoop it all up and throw it somewhere as mulch, which is another option. So I hope that that's helpful to give you some ideas on weed management here as we go into the summer, kind of the worst weeding time in my opinion, and good luck.